going to say. So I'm totally on tenterhooks. So can I invite you up to give your address and put me out of my misery? Thank you very much, and thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, Camilla. It's nice to be here. It's a pretty high-risk exercise, I must say, coming in at the end of a conference without any real sense of what anybody's been saying all day. My writing instructions from Camilla quite some time ago, she showed me one of these contracts and said, I want you to say they're legally enforceable.
Well, Robert told me to say that.
The words to that effect. All I know about what you've been talking about today is what I see from this program. I've actually come from Sydney this morning. I think I just picked up to go to the airport at 4:45 to catch a 6:20 flight out. So I'm kind of in a different time zone. But anyway, let's see how we go. I'm delighted to be here to support, especially in that field of the what we were discussing earlier, the work that Robert Rui, is that
Robert De Roy down there, and Adrian
have been doing, which I think is a bold and, as Humphrey might have said, courageous initiative. I actually tried to, in just preparing some notes this afternoon, I went to Google and looked up comic book contracts all over the times, this conference and your work and Rob's work. So you're right on the cutting edge.
We can feel it sometimes.
It seems to me there are a number of issues raised by, and I'm focusing on the use of graphics, either alone or in combination with the written word, to evidence simple contracts. In fact, one might have thought that if Dr. McCoy from Star Trek were looking at the Fruit Pickers contract, which I have had a look at briefly, he might have said to Captain Kirk, it's a contract, Jim, but not a contract as we know it. So I suppose the important question is, can pictures be used to convey meaning that can be given legal effect? Must they always be supplemented? I suspect they must, by oral explanation and or a written text. There's a useful little discussion of pictures and language in the Britannica, and they talk about pictures which do not represent language to be distinguished from writing, but it does. That's not to say that pictures can't convey meaning, but the question we have is it a meaning which has a content which the law can interpret and apply? And we know pictorial signs. They give you instructions, stop, turn, cross, all that sort of stuff. We're talking about something, I think, much more complex than that. We know about emojis. And you might know about, some of you might be old enough, I found it looking around the room, to remember Marshall McLuhan, who spoke of the electronic age, the age when we moved, as he saw it, from the linear thinking process, which the invention of print brought in, and the way that shaped consciousness, into the world of the electronic media, where, as he put it, you go through a cloud of images and come out with a general impression. I actually read some judgments that gave me the impression that they were written by people who were using electronic images on occasion. But so there is this question of what kind of meaning can pictures convey? At the outset, we ask about the nature of a contract, because we are talking about contracts. And without getting into a fine technical definition, I would speak in terms of an agreement which is intended to be legally binding, involving promises which give rise to rights and obligations on both sides. The species, the mechanisms of formation, think about it, there's oral, by speech, gesture, handshake. I remember once getting off a plane at Darwin, and I think it was Warren Anderson, who was a West Australian entrepreneur of some fame some years ago, was up there. He built their Parliament House and their court, and had fallen into, and there was a leaseback arrangement, one of these public-private partnerships with the Northern Territory government, and they'd fallen into dispute. And I was walking off the tarmac. I was on the same plane and chatting to his lawyer, who was saying of this dispute, more in sorrow than in anger. It's a great pity. He said, Warren's just a handshake kind of a guy. And this was a reflection on, I suppose, how he thought one should view the nature of the relationship which should have existed between the Northern Territory government in this rather complex public-private partnership and his client. We have, of course, written contracts which can have an immense variety. You can have a short, handwritten, scribbled note, which can sometimes end up in court and create huge problems of interpretation. It might be elliptical, it might be ungrammatical, it might be vaguely illogical. You can have the long, complex, carefully framed contract with all going into hundreds and hundreds of clauses, which also tend to present their own problems of interpretation. Just because it's long and complex doesn't mean that it doesn't generate the same sorts of problems as the short elliptical one. Sometimes you say about statutes, especially the Migration Act, which started out, I think, in 1958 with 61 sections and now has over 700 and alphanumerics and so forth. And all of this was designed to create greater certainty, less room for challenge to ministerial decisions and so forth, defining criteria for the grants of various classes of visa. But all it demonstrated to me was that every new word that they put in is a new jurisdictional error waiting to happen. There is always an argument about language in the written form. It's a bit like Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty. Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty from the quantum is at the heart of quantum theory, and I translated it into plain English as nothing in the universe can be nailed down. And under that theory, for example, if you cool something right down to absolute zero, let's take an element, you cool it right down to absolute zero, because nothing can be ever absolutely precise in terms of position and momentum, it's always jiggling. And so they call that zero-point energy. And they say that words have zero-point energy. There is always a nuance, a shade of meaning, and when you link them up together in a statute or a contract, they may put a bridge-like resonance and generate greater uncertainty. They may narrow the parameters of meaning in some ways, but long, complex, short, they always present, or often present, interpretive problems. They may be negotiated, or they may be terms offered on a taking or leaving basis, and that's something that I want to raise at the end in relation to the comic book contract. And of course one can have contracts which are partly oral and partly written. One can have contracts by conduct. So you walk into a shop, you pick up an item, you present it at the counter, and you might not even say anything. You might just say, I'll take it. And there's the invitation to treat, as they call the price, and you hand over the money, take the contract, hardly a word is exchanged, and you've had a contract for the purchase of goods. Pictures can form part of regular contracts. One of the examples I remember from many years ago, a very simple example, I was still in practice at the time, and I went to the barbers and hairdressers, they now call it, the barber there. And a leading Perth silk sat down in the seat next to mine. He will remain nameless. He later became a Supreme Court judge, but he had a certain concern about his appearance, and he just pulled out a photograph from his pocket and said to the barber, like that. That was the contract. That's how he wanted his hair done. Now, of course, we have many contracts, very complex contracts. Let's say a construction contract, which will be, which will incorporate in its terms plans and drawings of great complexity, and perhaps even flowcharts. That's not a minor matter. So here we have pictures giving content to otherwise speech which is otherwise empty of content or requires supplementation to give full meaning to it, or a text which is incomplete without the picture. So there's nothing new about that notion that pictures can form parts, or pictorial representation can form parts of contracts. Can, however, a picture standing alone convey meaning? And I'm thinking here of the Citrus Pickers contract, which is the one I have seen. It is hard to imagine the citrus picker just being shown the pictures and asked to sign here. There is a text, of course, there's a brief text, there's a couple of words associated with the pictures. And I'm assuming I might be dealing with, we might be dealing with somebody who can't read, or somebody whose English or language capacity is very limited. Then one imagines that the picture will be presented along with some kind of explanation. And that starts to look like a contract which is partly oral and partly not written, but partly pictorial. And we know we can have pictures to give content to another medium of conveying meaning. So I imagine we're not necessarily faced with the problem of just interpreting a picture on its own. And if we can fit it into the logical category of what is likely to occur, that is to say, a combination of media, speech, perhaps the text, if we assume that the text can be read and comprehended, and the picture, all of those things together would convey meaning. And there's no reason in principle then why a picture in that sense cannot be used to define or evidence an agreement and to convey the agreement to undertake certain rights or to undertake certain obligations and to confer certain rights. But it's hard to see how it can happen with a freestanding picture, and that's the thought experiment you need to have. Can I imagine a contract purely pictorial which would convey to some third party who might be asked to resolve a dispute an unambiguous statement of the rights and duties of the parties to the contract? And again, the test is, or a test is, the thought experiment. Suppose you just took the picture, showed it to the other party and said, look at this, and if you're happy, sign here. What are they doing if they sign here? The nature of the interpretive exercise, of course, that courts undertake requires identification of meaning, and it would seem to me that if one is faced with the problem of interpreting a comic book contract along the lines of perhaps the Citrus Pickers contract, and I'm taking that because it seems to be a very simple, straightforward case, then the interpretation will be contextual, and ordinary principles of interpretation can be invoked. Now, they are brought along, although it's utterly inapposite in this case, the High Court's judgment in Mount Bruce and Wright Prospect, which was about large, complex commercial contracts. But in a joint judgment of Justice Neville and Gordon and myself, we set out applicable legal principles in these cases. And so the rights and liabilities of parties under a provision of a contract are determined objectively by reference to its text, context, the entire context of the contract, as well as any contract document or statutory provision referred to in the text of the contract, and purpose. Now, it then goes on and on about extraneous circumstances and ambiguity, constructional choice and all. And of course, the kind of contract that is being looked at here is a different universe away from the kind of contract that we are looking at when we're talking about the comic book contract. But the basic principles, I think, are readily applicable in the sort of setting which I have suggested. And if they can be interpreted, if they can be given meaning, then yes, Camilla, I think they're enforceable. So, picture, explanation, text, surrounding circumstances known to the parties. These are the things that courts would look to as they would look to, which they would look to in the interpretation of any contract. I have one final query here, because I know that this class of contract is in part directed to people who may have limited literacy or are not sophisticated in legal understanding, and to enable them to fully grasp, as it were, what they're signing up for. And I noticed that there was when I saw there was an explanation of probation period, that if you didn't pick enough apples or whatever the fruit was, if it just fell below the dotted line in the first 3 weeks, off you go. You would be sad and kicked out. If it's above the dotted line, everybody cheers you and gives you a medal and you're hired. But the query I have is, it does not seem to me that the nature of comic book contracts, and no doubt somebody will correct me, is such that there's much room for negotiation. These things have to be prepared in advance as a practical matter. Does the other party get to put in a different drawing? Or is this a drawing which is presented? Is it really only amenable to what would be contracts of adhesion? In other words, contracts that are presented on a take it or leave it basis. Of course, comic book contracts, no more than ordinary contracts, deal with questions of implication, common law implications. They still have to, they still roar around all of this, nor the statutory incursions which can affect the terms of contracts, and those I wouldn't have thought are necessarily going to be explained in a simple comic book contract. The workplace relations legislation, which might impact on, for example, the OH&S legislation, the whole array of statutory things which shape, modify, qualify contractual rights and obligations. So, although McCoy said, in my imagining, not contract as we know it, I don't think it's all that far from contract as we know it, and I think the courts probably would be able to deal with it. Thanks.
Thank you. I realise the full depth of the difficulty of trying to comment on the conference that you haven't been able to attend because you had to travel. But obviously your findings is something that brings joy to many of us. I think it was a very elegant solution to I still think it's quite a complex question. I'm happy to answer your query, and so is Robert, I think. But perhaps we should do it over a drink because I think everyone's really tired. We've been at it for 2 days now, and already yesterday people were telling me that they were very happy but their heads were full, and I'm sure that's not getting better after today. But I would like to just sum up a couple of things, just to draw some highlights from this conference, because this has been about circles for me, circles that point back to things that have happened and circles that point forward to things that will happen. And that lovely interconnectivity, I really loved the symbol that Bruce created, that circle. And I think that's so beautiful. This is all about connecting innovators in law, and there are so many different things and so many different kinds of visual contracts that we've been seeing the potential of. We're just scratching the surface. Technology and the availability of illustrators and the negotiation settings and all of the things that we could potentially do, it just blows the mind. Wow, so I love the metaphor of it's a contract but not as we know it, Jim. Maybe it's not as far as right now, but I think what we can do will probably surprise Jim down the line, and maybe it will. So I have nothing left to say now, but thank you. Thank you to all of you for coming, our international speakers, for flying across the world to be here for a day and a half or 2 days and then flying all the way back again. You're going to be exhausted for weeks and it'll all be my fault. But I'm still incredibly grateful. We've got speakers from Finland, California, Nomad, everywhere, Miami, South Africa, just everywhere. It's amazing. So, and thank you for all of you for coming and participating and engaging, because innovation like this, as Bob says, cutting edge, it doesn't work without innovators engaging and coming together and collaborating. And as we remove those silos that Jenny talked about yesterday, as we begin to see the cracks in the concrete and peeking at each other's skill sets, the interchangeability of what we can do with each other is just so exciting. So thank you. And thank you to my fantastic support team, to Chris and Eloise, who have run around and made it look really easy. Everyone has And thank you to my lovely research team. You shall remain nameless because I've thanked you enough. But thank you to the law school for their support. This is part of the narrative of the 90th birthday of the law school, and this is a very important story. So I hope that you'll take one of those narrative little pamphlets that are outside, and I encourage you to try and contribute a narrative about this conference as part of the celebrations of that 90th. That would be lovely. So yeah, informal drinks, pay for your own, I'm afraid, in the Uni Club. I've overextended my budget slightly. But I really hope that you take away something that you can use, and don't forget you are more creative than you can realize. Thank you so much. And that's all, folks.
Oh yes, I have been around.
It's like